Welcome to St. John, Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Travel with us again, my friends. This time to July 4th, 1917. The world is at war. The Great War. The war to end all wars. In St. John, we see it's a foggy evening, unremarkable in the port city. Fort Howe is once again an active military fortification, but not much of one. It is home to a munitions magazine located on the north side of the hill, which is surrounded by a rickety old fence, and a drill shed over on the south side. These are considered low-risk installations, but we're at war. They still require 24/7 guarding by active soldiers. This night, Commanding Officer Lance Corporal Walter Ham and his friend, Private Hermenegilde Arsenault, are doing what young lads would do whether at wartime or peacetime, flirting with girls who they met up with at the top of the hill. Private Harold Garland is left behind to guard the magazine. It is 9:30 p.m. Private Arsenault comes off the hill to relieve Garland, who continues to hang out around the guardhouse. The evening is warm despite the fog, and there's nothing to do at the guardhouse. At 10 p.m., another soldier, Private Joseph Panett, a 31-year-old who barely speaks English, runs down off the hill. Panett is stopped by Arsenault with the phrase, "Halt, who goes there?" The appropriate response is friend or visiting patrol. Panett does not respond to the first command to halt, nor the second. A gunshot breaks the silence of the night as Arsenault fires his rifle at Panett. Fortunately, he misses. The two soldiers argue, with Panett coming right up into young Arsenault's face, demanding to know why he shot at him. Arsenault responds that he was ordered to do so by Lance Corporal Ham. The two soldiers are able to work it out. No harm, no foul. This time. Ham now comes down off the hill. He is stopped by Arsenault with the same line, "Halt, who goes there?" Ham, however, does respond. "Corporal of the guard," he says. The usual next response is a call, "Advance and be recognized." Arsenault, however, omits this procedure and keeps to his rounds. Corporal Ham is new to the junior officer rank and also loves a good prank. Under the cover of fog, Ham runs into the enclosure that Private Arsenault is guarding and hides by the magazine to await his friend's return. Arsenault sees movement by the gate. Heart pounding, he goes in to investigate when a shadowy figure lunges at him, screaming, "You can't get me here!" Arsenault does not even hear the words, he simply reacts. For the second time that night, he fires his rifle. This time, he hits his target. The bullet punches through Walter Ham's lower right abdomen and blows out a hole in his pelvis and back. Garland and Panett now join Arsenault and watch their commanding officer fall and begin to bleed out. Arsenault is the first to act. He grabs a blanket to place it under Ham's head. Garland sprints down the road to the general store that has a telephone. He calls for an ambulance. Meanwhile, William Cullen, a wounded veteran who had heard the shots, races to the scene. He disarms Arsenault and questions the soldier. Arsenault sobs and says, "I didn't know it was Ham. I didn't know it was Ham." The first police officer arrives. He sees Ham lying on his stomach. The Lance Corporal is pale and moans. The blood pooling around him continues to grow. "I'm not shot as bad as you think I am," Ham says. But Ham is wrong. The ambulance arrives 10 to 15 minutes after Garland's call, and Ham is jostled along the 15 to 20 minute ride to the general hospital. Upon arrival, the hospital wants to move him to a military facility. Ham cries out, "For God's sakes, do not move me again." Realizing the seriousness of the soldier's condition, he is treated by a resident physician and a military doctor who just happened to be at the general. is now an hour after the shooting. In excruciating pain, Ham is adamant to relieve his friend Arsenault of any wrongdoing by saying it was not his fault. This will prove to be his last words. Lance Corporal Walter Scott Ham dies at 1:05 a.m. on July 5th, 1917. He is 18 years old and had enlisted at the age of 17. Private Arsenault is 15 and had enlisted at the age of 14. Two boys who are too young to be soldiers. Hi, I'm Mark, and over there, that's Greg, and that means St. John, nothing happened here. With the exception of a 15-year-old soldier shooting his 18-year-old commanding officer in First World War. Welcome back, Greg. It's been a while. We've taken the summer off from recording, so welcome back to the studio. Are you feeling good?
I am. I'm ready to go.
Okay. Well caffeinated?
You can see it right here.
Oh, I can see it. I can see it. Our listeners can't see it, but Greg is pounding back a coffee. So Greg is ready to go. I have a surprise today, Greg.
What is it?
We have a guest.
Wow.
So
great.
Joining us today, we have Heather McBriarty. She is author of 2 books related to the First World War, one being Somewhere in Flanders, and another being a novel, Amid the Splintered Trees. And I love this novel. It does such a nice job of giving the perspectives of both sides of the pond. I won't say anything more because I don't want to spoil anything. But if you want to pick up a copy of this book, it's available at Partridge Island Publishing and Books. That's located in the Container Village in St. John. And while I'm at it, I'd like to give a shout out to Amanda Evans and Shannon Dykins, the people who run Partridge Island Books. They are doing a great job in supporting local books and authors. But welcome to the show, Heather.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me, and thank you for those very kind words on my books.
Again, love it. But let's go back to the First World War. Now, we have just heard the story of Lance Corporal Walter Ham and Private Arsenault. Where did you find this story?
It started with a trip to Fern Hill Cemetery in St. John. I was kind of interested to find out they have a field of honor there with headstones honoring First and Second World War casualties. Most of them were actually died here in St. John. So I found all their names, and I was mostly interested in the First World War, but I copied down their names, and then I searched for their military records at Library and Archives Canada. And I found his story, and it was incredibly fascinating. And it was a story I had never heard before. And it's kind of almost seems like it was lost to St. John history.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for bringing it back into the world, because it would have been lost if you hadn't stumbled upon it. And it really illustrates that issue that we'll be talking about today, and that is boy soldiers. Now, it's not just a St. John issue, and it's not just a Canadian issue, but we're going to be talking about it from a Canadian perspective. To give us some insight on this, we need to know what was happening, what started the First World War. And we had a challenge. We talked about this when we were discussing the episode. We have a challenge. Who can come up with the most succinct explanation of a very complex situation? And that is everything that went into the beginning of First World War. And Heather, you said you could do it in 8 lines.
Well, maybe not 8 lines, 8 sentences, but 10? Maybe.
Let's see.
3 minutes. How about 3 minutes?
3 minutes. Okay, yeah. Heather,
go.
Have you
got the timer? Okay. Let's go back. 1839. Britain signs a pact to preserve Belgium's neutrality. Belgium was kind of a buffer country between France, Germany, Netherlands. 1892, France and Russia sign an alliance. In 1904, Britain was actually added to that alliance, and that was the formation of the Triple Entente. You may hear that word when you're reading about the First World War. And that left Germany in the middle, their only ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those were the Central Powers. So 1905, 1906, the German Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen devised a deployment plan for a decisive attack and capture of France, because Germany and France really kind of hated each other. 1908, we're getting there. Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia-Herzegovina. And that brings us to the summer of 1914, and Europe is absolutely a bubbling cauldron of conflict going on. Austria-Hungary is struggling to control their Balkan states, of which Bosnia-Serbia was one. Everybody in Europe was in an arms race to get the best army, the best weaponry, the best navies. And then on June 28th, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, the 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And Austria declared war in the Balkans. And everybody actually in Europe, for the most part, thought it was a justified war, except for Russia, because they were sympathetic to the Serbians and they were on the Serbian side. So now there's Germany stuck in the middle. France hates them. Russia hates them. Russia's attacking Germany's friend. Germany can't fight on the Russian front unless they take care of France first. They can't go through the heavily fortified French-Germany border, so they enact the Schlieffen Plan. A lightning strike, the Schlieffen Plan. Lightning strike through Belgium into France, take Paris, neutralize France, then they can go take care of the Russians.
What could possibly go wrong?
Flawless plan, right?
Flawless. Kind of like the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Exactly. Except for that first step into Belgium now activates the British treaty with Belgium. Britain is forced to step in and help Belgium. And that starts the race to the sea, another concept or a term you'll hear. So the Germans were trying to go around the British. They were trying to move up. And fortunately for Belgium or for Ypres, the British got to the sea first. They stopped the Germans in their tracks. But the other thing it did, it brought in Canada, it brought in Newfoundland, it brought in Australia, New Zealand, and India as colonies of Great Britain. They were drawn into the war. Trenches are set up. There's a stalemate, and the fighting goes on for 4 long, bloody, brutal years.
And that is the First World War in 4 minutes.
Yeah.
4 minutes.
By Heather McBriarty.
Yay.
Excellent. Well done. Well done.
I just want to say that there was some opposition within all those countries to going to war, but I think Heather mentioned the Schlieffen Plan or whatever. But all the military planners had their timetables, and a lot of that seems to have just kicked in, right? So
yes,
Canada was dragged along for the uncertain future, right, of what was happening in late summer 1914.
Absolutely. So we have, Heather, you laid it out, and especially the background, that this was boiling up for many years. And I like that you mentioned the arms race, is that we were starting to see weapons like the world had never seen before being introduced. So everyone seemed to be champing at the bit to use these weapons. But the UK has a kind of friendship with France, but it doesn't want to get involved. If it was just France being attacked, they probably wouldn't have been involved. But the Belgium thing brought it in. And then, as you said, the fortification happened. So that is World War I, the beginning, in a nutshell. The First World War. Now, let's go into it. Did the British Empire see this coming? Greg, what do you think?
That's tough. I'm not really an expert on the broader empire, but just reading the Canadian newspapers at the time, there's certainly some hints that there might be war clouds, as they used to say, forming, a lot of attention to what the Navy was doing and things like that, the Royal Navy. But I think the British Empire was, the dominions like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland were conditioned to think that Britain was almost invincible because of its Navy. So I think that that shapes the initial response that, Britain will handle this. Britain will handle this, right? And you can see the confidence. Maybe it's kind of a naive feeling, right?
There was some discussion before war actually broke out in Europe in Parliament about the need to up the militia in Canada. And I wish I had a quote from that session. Actually, I do. I do have a quote. Get this. This is an actual quote that was said in Parliament in June of 1914. Here it is. There is no danger in sight. Why then raise the militia of this country to the enormous figure of between 75,000 and 80,000 men? There is no reason for it. There is no emergency in sight, and there will be none in our day and generation. And within 2 months of that, the world is starting one of the most bloodiest conflicts in human history. And by the end of this, we will have Canada and Newfoundland mobilizing 650,000 soldiers with 66,000 killed and 172,000 wounded. Now, we're talking about boy soldiers here. So that gave us a background of World War I, and that it didn't come completely expected from the British side of this. So there was a need to mobilize quickly. Heather, what did the Canadian military look like before the mobilization for the First World War?
Well, they had barely more than 3,000 regular soldiers, and they were totally under the command of British officers, which enormously annoyed the Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes, later Sir Sam Hughes.
Did he get knighted?
He got knighted, yes.
Oh, he did?
Yes.
Wow. That's another topic. I'd like to get into Sammy Hughes someday, maybe another podcast.
I'm sure he campaigned heavily for that. Probably Lord Beaverbrook is the one who arranged that for him. I think they were good friends.
Oh, this is a story.
Yes, but absolutely, it was a very, very small, regular, professional army. However, there was a lot of militias. Every community in Canada had their own little militia. Even at that time, there were about . Men and boys, because they could be as young as 16 in a militia, were involved and were trained. A lot of them were veterans of the South African War from the turn of the previous century. We had a militia on one hand, and we had a very tiny professional army on the other hand, and neither really communicated much with the other, I don't believe.
Okay, so there certainly was a need to get the numbers up in the regular army. So militia would have been a source for recruiting and getting to the levels. And it's my understanding that Canada determined their initial call, they would need at least 20,000 for the initial deployment. I believe Britain was asking for 22,500.
The Order in Council on the 10th of August, 1914, the Canadian government committed to recruiting 25,000.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So going from 3,000 regular soldiers and officers to 25,000 overnight, that is quite the undertaking. So you had that going on, and you can see if they're drawing from the militia that happen to have in its rank and file boys, you
Correct.
Can see how this is kind of setting up how boys ended up being sent overseas to fight in the war. Now, Greg, they mobilized right away the Royal Canadian Navy, which was no easy feat.
Well, no, because there were only two vessels, and one was on one coast and one was on the other. I think the one on the west, these were 1897 vintage surplus cast-off British stuff that had wooden decks, so if a shell came on top, basically go right through the deck. And the one on the west coast kept breaking down. And the one on the East Coast, of course, was protecting the East Coast. And I believe there's artillery. One of the cannons off that vessel is outside the Naval Reserve Unit in St. John now. So when the balloon went up, as the British like to say, we had these two old vessels, and I think we relied on the Royal Navy, strategically, as the ultimate protector of Canada.
The British Navy, not the Canadian Navy with its two aging ships.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say I believe you are correct. You reminded me, Greg. That is the gun off the Niobe. The HMS Niobe is in front of the Brunswicker. So.
Okay, so what we have now is we have the formulation of something new to Canada, and that's the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So it was formulated before the First World War, and I believe, Heather, they disbanded, but some of the battalions or regiments within the Canadian Expeditionary Force still exist today.
That's correct. There was a great rearranging constantly through the war.
I just thought I'd mention some of the units that were around St. John when the day, August 5th, which seems to be the day that St. John woke up and read the newspaper. So, and there's an article on August 6th, the soldiers of St. John are enthusiastic. 28th New Brunswick Dragoons, the 62nd Fusiliers, the 3rd Regiment Royal Canadian Artillery, Princess Louise 8th Hussars, and the Royal Canadian Infantry, which sent men down from Fredericton. So, they might not have all been St. John based, but these are some of the units that were converging on St. John in early August and drawing in recruits every day.
Okay, so we're off to war. Question is, why did Canada resort to recruiting underaged soldiers? Let's begin with that. So you had the original drive for recruitment, and tens of thousands of people answered the initial call to war. We have the recruitment qualifications for the initial recruitment. Heather, what were they? Like, how big did I have to be? How old did I have to be a soldier in the Canadian Expeditionary Force?
The age requirements were 18 to 45. Of those, you had to be over 19 or under 42 to actually go and fight at the front. There certainly was a height requirement. There was a minimum chest size requirement. I'm just trying to think. 5'3"?
5'3". 5'3". And this will be possibly the fun fact of the podcast. What do you believe was the average height of a man in Britain in 1914?
Not as tall as we are?
Not as, well said, not as tall as we are. The answer is 5'2". The average height, if you were from the aristocratic population, it would have been 5'6". And the reason they believed for the height was bad healthcare, malnutrition. So this war really brought it to light the problems that were happening within the British Empire as far as healthcare and malnutrition. But 5'2", I would have been a giant.
That is tiny, really.
That is that's just over 100 years ago. And what was the average height of a soldier?
Actually, that was fairly tall. I always thought it was kind of a short. It was 5'6", and I thought, geez, that's not very tall. But when you look at the average height, they were pretty big guys. And the giants at 5'8", you had to be 5'8" to be a gunner. So they're really big guys.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So you'd go in, you had to meet those requirements. So I would go in, of course, with my birth certificate, Greg and Heather, and it would say clearly in a government-issued photo ID that I was over the age of 18 and I would be accepted. No, that didn't happen, did it?
No.
That didn't even exist.
Very few people had a birth certificate. Come on.
Yeah, so it was on my representation, self-reporting my age. And I would say, okay, if I wanted to go to war and I was aware of the requirements that I had to be 18, then I would say I'm 18, 19. Sometimes they went way overboard. Like Walter Ham actually went into the recruiting office at the age of 17 and said he was 26. I don't think he had to go that high.
No, he
Why
didn't.
he went that high, I have no idea. Especially when he was 5'2", 100 pounds, I believe. But he went in on the high end and go, no, I'm 26. And anyone supposedly would have looked at Walter Ham and go, you're not 26. You're not even 18. You'd be lucky if you're 15. But people would go on site and go, yeah, kind of look like you're 18. You could pass as 18. So you had those requirements. And then your parents could consent, couldn't they?
Yes. And actually, if you were under 19, your parents had to sign a consent for you or give their verbal consent.
And originally, they could revoke that consent.
Correct. Yes.
And get you back. But then there was a court case that came up as the war dragged on and when the demand for warm bodies came up. And they go, no, once you sign a contract with the Army, you belong to the Army, regardless of consent, not consent, lying about your age. So you're with us now.
Just want to say it's interesting, that 19 thing, Heather, because my understanding is that the age of majority was still 21. So that, it sounds like, the military is getting a little bit of a tweaking on that, because, age of majority would mean like if someone was working as an adult child, they legally had to give their wages to their parents, for example. Right,
till the age of 21.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure it was always enforced. Anyway, it's just a nice and interesting tweak and on that age of majority thing. And I don't know if we have enough historical research on that subject, but you can see why the military would want to bend that if possible.
They've always made their own rules, though, haven't they?
Yeah,
pretty much. So you had that original fervor, the patriotic fervor, and I want to go to war, and the best of the best go on the first wave. Greg, I think you found an article in a St. John newspaper.
Yeah, again, early in the war, announcing at this point they were saying 21,000, of whom 13,000 would be infantry. It's interesting, too, Heather might speak this. There's a lot of specialist troops, even by World War I. It's not all infantry anymore, right? It's not infantry and artillery, but all the other support troops. But only the best will be chosen for the Canadian contingent, read the headline. So if you're reading that, you're going to think, oh my God, this might be my only chance to go over and help Britain.
But Greg, I want to be the best.
You are the best, Mark.
Well, okay, then I better go to war now. So you can see the pressure.
Yeah.
like they're poking at all the buttons that get people motivated to do this, including children. Yeah. So you had that original call up, and then the interest in joining began to wane pretty quickly. I believe when the injured and the dead began to pour in the information about them. And by 1915, recruitment dropped, especially in Quebec and the Maritimes. And the recruitment requirements changed. So they dropped the height requirement to 5'2". They took away in the summer of 1915 the rights of parents to take underage boys out of the military. And then you got the calls for conscription. So you're going to war whether you like it or not. That probably changed the recruiting practices quite a bit. So there were boys who wanted to go to war, and they would go to recruiting offices. And let's just play this out. Heather, I'm a boy. You look at me, I'm clearly 14. And I go to you and I go, I want to join the Army and I'm 14. What are you going to say? Are you going to say no to me in the height of conscription when your regiment really needs the numbers?
I'm going to tell you to go outside and have another birthday or 2 or 3 and then come back in.
Yeah, so those kind of things were happening. So it was a knowingly letting people, boys who were underage, join up. So let's just play this again, Heather. So you're not like that. You're not telling me to walk around the building and go have 4 other birthdays. 5 would be best because then I could go to the front line. You don't do that. You go, yeah, Green, get out of here. You're not going to be going to war. Then I go over to Greg's recruiting office and I go, hey, guess what? I'm 19. And what does Greg say to me, Greg?
Sign right here, son.
Yes. Yes, no questions asked. So this is what would happen if I got shut down by one recruitment office. If I was really determined to go to war and I was underage, I could likely find someone. There was no cross-referencing. There were no computer systems saying, okay, yeah, you know what? You just got denied over here. You can't just come over to another place.
And that happened with Ermengild. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Arsenault, our young fellow who here in St. John. He went to 3 different recruiting offices, and he told each of them that he was 14, and the first 2 turned him away, and the third signed him up, knowing he was, at the time, 14 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, so it begs the question, why would boys want to join to go over to one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history? What are some of the reasons? Well, let's talk about pay to begin with. And regardless of what age you say you are or what age you are, you got the same pay, and it was pretty decent. So you're talking about $1.10 per day plus rations, quarters, and uniforms. And rations, I was reading this, maybe it wasn't a good variety of food, but there was a lot of it. You were getting 4,000 calories per day.
The Canadians were fed very well, actually better than the British at that time, but they were fed very well. And these boys are getting more money and more food than they probably ever saw at home.
Exactly, because a lot of them were escaping poverty and bad jobs and horrible situations. So childhood was a different thing back then, wasn't it, in 1914?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit it there with jobs. You know, a lot of these 14, 15, 16-year-olds were out working. They were working men, so to speak. They had left school probably a few years before. Up until 1910, they only had to go till they were age 12. You know, they weren't children as we see them as children.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. In that society, they were seen as more grown up. They were expected to earn a living.
So it wasn't the same concept of childhood that, play is the work of the child. It is the work is the work of children. And you could have children working in coal mines.
Just want to make a little comment from the academic world. The idea of the teenager hadn't really arrived yet, right? Experts were starting to talk about the adolescent, the juvenile delinquent, but the idea of the teenager who goes to high school, who doesn't go to work till later, that hasn't arrived yet. And the job thing is really interesting too, Mark and Heather, because the improvement in the overall economy and high wages and low unemployment help create that opening for boy soldiers as well, because fewer men in their 20s were showing up. Farmers' sons were needed on the farm. There was full employment, high, heavy production around the clock. So they kind of create conditions for boys to join, because the older men, the older youth, there's not as many of them around. Mm-hmm. They're working.
And then you had as well the seeking of adventure and the romanticized vision of war. And that would have come from boys hearing about the Boer War and all the glory of the battlefield. So you can imagine that pressing down on them and saying, yeah, I want to join. And then peer pressure. Yep. Everyone around them saying, well, why aren't you going to war? All you have to do is say you're 19 and you're off, but you can stick behind and not do your bit for king and country. So that's adding to the pressure on boys to be enlisting. Then you put in the revenge for death of a family member, which started to play in when my father was killed over there. My brothers were killed over there. I want to go and reap revenge upon the Hun. So you had those things happening, and then perception of youthful invincibility.
Yeah, Heather, cadets, do you have any thoughts on that, on the importance of the cadet movement? That was something that was underway, wasn't it?
Along with the militias, taking the 16-year-olds, pretty much most of the schools had cadet programs. So these young men, boys, were exposed to militaristic training from a fairly young age. Actually, what I found out, there were actually girls in the militias.
Oh.
I don't know what, I didn't find out what their actual role was, but there were girls involved in the militia. But
Interesting.
to bring it back to these young men, is the uniforms and the parading and marching and carrying probably a wooden gun, not a real one, over your shoulder, that sense of brotherhood and belonging that perhaps they didn't get from families. Maybe they didn't have families. So there's a real sense of excitement, I think, because they're involved in something bigger than themselves that they feel they belong to.
I have a little story from the St. John newspaper here from the war. Cadets, it doesn't say what age, were marched from the armory, the barracks in the South End, to St. Andrew's and St. Stephen Church, where a minister gave them a sermon on their duty as young men. And it's interesting. It hits a lot of the things we've talked about. First of all, be manly, but do not engage in brute force like the Germans do. That's not the British way. But be courageous to stand up to brute force. Be Christian. Be manly like Christ. Do your duty. Honor, keep your honor and keep your word, which is an inherent British trait, unlike the Germans who did not keep their word and have no honor. And again, resist this brute force. So these were young men and had to wear kilts, by the way. And I'm not sure if it was a standalone cadet corps, but it's just a little story I saw in the newspaper. The messages of masculinity. You're going to be a man. During wartime, you have to do your bit, right? And so imagine all that peer pressure.
Well, Greg, you convinced me. I'm going to war.
Okay, Mark, I'm not sure. You in a kilt? Would it work?
I don't have the legs for it, but that's a whole nother issue. Here are some interesting things. As we said, this was not a Canadian thing. Only the boy soldiers. This was used straight across, and still is an issue today. I'll ask you this question. What age do you think the youngest soldier to serve for the British Army?
Very.
Very. I love your responses, Heather. Very.
Very.
Really young. Yes.
I know there was a 14-year-old killed very early in the war, a British soldier. Younger than that?
Younger than that, it would be Sidney Lewis, recruited at the age of 12, fought in the Somme at 13.
Jeez.
That was one of the bloodiest battles. Okay, so you had that. Now, youngest soldier to serve in any army in the First World War. Go.
10.
Younger.
Sounds
so
like
it's Monsignor Gavrick at the age of 8.
8.
8. Became Lance Sergeant at the age of 10. Now, sad story behind him is that his family was annihilated by the Austrian-Hungary army. He lost his boyhood that day when he watched his family slaughtered. And he went to the Serbian army and go, I want revenge. And they saw that he was no longer a boy. He wanted revenge. And they said, yeah, you do it. And he went on to fight in the Second World War. When he finally became of age.
Finally of age.
But he would have fought the entire time in the First World War and would have finished it off at the age of 12.
That's appalling. Appalling.
But okay, let's get on to what happened to the boys when they went over. So you had to be 19 to go to the front lines. If you were under 19 and you were 18, you were held back until you were 19. But as we know, all you had to really say is, I'm 19. So we had boys under the age of 19, under the age of 18, actually on the front lines. So there was finally a move in 1917 to go, okay, we know that there are underage soldiers on the front lines. We got to get them back. So there was an order sent out saying, yeah, if they're 16 and a half or younger, they're getting hauled off the front lines right away and given a one-way ticket back to Canada. So we had that. What happened to the other ones? If you were 16 and a half or older.
Well, if you delayed long enough, they'd age into into being able to be over there. So the Army was very reluctant to let the 17-year-olds go because in a few months, up to a year, they were going to be 18.
And a lot of them were good soldiers, and they didn't want to lose good soldiers. And then the other thing going on, Heather, is a lot of the boys wanted to stay.
Yeah, there was one, I believe he was a Canadian soldier, who was underage, and he was hauled back to England, and he ran away and went back to the front.
Yeah.
He wanted to be at the front, and he was 16 years old, but he got yanked out of the trenches, but he was determined to go back with his friends and serve at the front in the trenches. And I'm not 100% sure what happened to him after that point. I believe he survived.
So they were slow, especially if the soldier goes, I want to stay. They were really slow complying with that requirement to get off the front lines. And then sometimes they go, well, you know what, we'll keep you here, but we'll take you out of harm's way. There really was no place out of harm's way. So we had soldiers behind the communication trenches, and they were doing water runs and munitions runs, those kind of things. And then they would get shelled. So it was not a safe place. And I should mention this too, like the problems with having children on the front lines, like they're not developmentally ready for this type of work. And we had a case once that you had a 14-year-old on guard duty and would constantly fall asleep because 14-year-olds require way more sleep at that age because they're developing. Now, in the military, you could get executed for falling asleep. So it just wasn't the type of work conducive to someone still in the developmental stages. So you had a lot of problems with this, but then there was the good things that were looked upon by the military. I'm not saying these are good reasons to send boys off to war to kill and be killed, but you had the concept that boys were often considered good soldiers as they were mentally and physically fit, robust, adaptive, resilient, easily trained, well-disciplined, and appreciative. Except
teenage boys.
Except if you're their parents.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But other people, they fit those categories. So they were like, the boy soldiers are great. Yeah. But so you had 1917 come along. You had the orders. You had boys being sent back home if they were 16 and a half or younger. Then you had the 16 and a half or older being sent back to England and for training and being kept in England until they became of age and would return to the war. We had the formulation of the Boys Battalion, the YSB. Can you tell us about that, Heather?
That was actually a fantastic idea. These boys were kept there. They were kept in their training, but they were also put back to school. So they were being taught things, they were learning things, and probably for a lot of those boys, they may have left school very early in their life, so they were getting more education and were out of danger while they were there. And a lot of these young men, when the war ended, were able to go home to better jobs, further education, university, colleges, as a side benefit to being put in that youth battalion.
Yeah, it was great, and I think it was great because of who headed it up.
Correct.
So he really focused on education. But if you had someone different in that role heading up the youth battalion, I think you'd have a different outcome. But yeah, so you had that. And then that 1917 debate too about, boy soldiers being on the front lines, it was almost overshadowed by a greater concern than them being killed or killing people. And that is being exposed to the evils of alcohol.
Yes.
While over there, because they would get the same rations as any other soldiers, including daily rum. And there was an example that just brought the ire of the temperance movement in Canada. And that was news that an 18-year-old soldier was being a bartender.
Horrifying.
Isn't that horrific? Isn't that the worst thing you ever heard in the First World War, Heather?
Scandal, yes. Worst thing that could possibly happen to that young man.
Well, again, there's decades of temperance agitation and scientific temperance instruction in the schools showing that alcohol is a poison. And during World War I, a number of provinces, including New Brunswick, brought in provincial prohibition. And in 1918-19, Canada came the closest it ever came to having absolute prohibition in the name of the war effort. So you're getting these mixed messages on liquor and the war effort, right?
Yeah, and with alcohol being poison, do you know what else is poison, Greg? Poison.
Yes.
And what they were exposed to in the trenches, being poison gas and everything else.
Yeah.
But, alcohol, that's way up there.
Yeah.
But and with that, too, boy soldiers were almost overcompensating from what I read when they were there, because they were young, but they wanted to prove that they were as tough as any other soldier. So they would drink more than anyone, they'd smoke more, they'd curse more, they'd be louder, all those kind of things to try to say, hey, you know what, respect me. So, there was a lot going on there. But now we have to end it off with talking about the outcome of Canada's boy soldiers and the impact of the future. And these are the sad numbers. Estimated that 20,000 out of the 424,000 CEF forces serving overseas were underage. A high proportion number, and estimated that 2,200 underage soldiers were killed, others physically and psychologically wounded. And did this change the use of boy soldiers going into the Second World War?
No.
Nope. Not really. So there wasn't lessons learned on this, and still we had underaged boy soldiers in World War II. It really didn't gather steam, this movement to say the front lines of a war is no place for an underaged soldier. So we didn't really get the push to prohibit the use of child soldiers until pretty recent. You got the 1960s treaties to reduce the use of children in war, but it didn't really start getting a lot of steam until the 2000s. Now, it was prohibited in the British Army, but in other armies around the world, this is the sad fact of the podcast. Child soldiers are still engaged by some countries and military groups today. And it's estimated that 25% of the armed forces worldwide use child soldiers. And the number is increasing with the new conflicts that are entering the world stage. It is very sad, but it happened in 1914, happened way before 1914, happening today.
I think that brings it back to your discussion of why the military wanted boy soldiers in the First World War, that they were trainable and obedient. And I think the same thing still is happening. It's so easy to indoctrinate children and train them in a lot of ways, and that's still going on.
True, but sad. Mm-hmm. And that brings us to the end of the podcast. And again, proof. St. John, nothing happened here.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.